Imagine for a moment that you're 14 years old. You have royal blood coursing through your veins, and you've just discovered that your value as a human being comes down to exactly two biological characteristics that are in fundamental contradiction with each other. You must be virgin to maintain your honor and political worth, but you must also be fertile to fulfill your only purpose in life, producing male heirs. And here's the part that will break you. Failing either of these impossible tests means an automatic death sentence. Welcome to the world of medieval princesses, where being royal wasn't a privilege but a biological death sentence disguised as nobility, where your body didn't belong to you but was state property constantly evaluated for its reproductive capacity and sexual purity, where every day of your existence was a tightrope walk between preserving your virginity and proving your fertility, in an impossible balance that determined whether you'd live to see another sunrise. Today we're diving into one of history's most brutal and lethal obsessions, the contradictory demand that medieval princesses be simultaneously untouchable virgins and proven breeding machines. A biological paradox so impossible to satisfy that it turned the world's most powerful women into victims of a system that would kill them, regardless of the choices they made. Prepare to discover why being a medieval princess was essentially a delayed death sentence, why virginity examinations were public ceremonies more humiliating than executions, and why many princesses preferred the convent or even suicide rather than face the impossible tests of their royal femininity. Because after this story, you'll understand that the heaviest crown ever created wasn't made of gold and jewels, but of contradictory biological expectations that crushed entire generations of women under the weight of their own anatomy. Let's begin with something that will immediately freeze your blood. In the medieval world, a princess's virginity wasn't simply a personal matter of moral purity. It was a state document that required regular medical verification, public certification, and constant surveillance by specialists who turned the female body into a battlefield between family honor and political survival. The state-controlled virginity industry. Medieval princesses' virginity was so valuable, it was considered a national treasure equivalent to the kingdom's gold reserves. It was negotiated in international treaties, guaranteed in marriage contracts, and secured through surveillance methods that would make a modern security system seem relaxed. From the moment a princess reached puberty, her body became public property subject to regular inspection. Virginity examinations weren't private medical procedures. They were public ceremonies where teams of doctors, midwives, and female nobles physically examined the princess to confirm her hymen remained intact. French court records document that Marie Antoinette was subjected to public virginity examinations 3 times yearly from age 12 until 16, when she finally married. Each examination was witnessed by at least 20 official observers, and results were documented in reports sent to foreign courts as evidence of her continued purity. But here's what will really destroy you. These examinations didn't just verify the presence of the hymen. Doctors also evaluated whether the princess showed signs of sexual awakening that might indicate moral corruption, even without penetration. This included examining breast development, vaginal moisture, and even her physical reactions to medical contact. Medical treatises of the era specified that a truly pure princess should show no physical response to examination, even when doctors inserted instruments to verify intact depth. Princesses who showed any sign of involuntary arousal during these violating procedures were declared morally compromised, even if their hymen remained technically intact. Records from the Royal Archive of Castile contain the devastating case of Infanta Isabel of Aragon, who at 15 was declared impure in spirit after examiners noted she became moist during the verification procedure. Though technically virgin, she was deemed unsuitable for royal marriage and spent the rest of her life confined in a convent as punishment for her inappropriate carnal response. But the obsession with virginity went far beyond medical examinations. Princesses lived under constant surveillance, designed to preserve their purity in ways that turned their daily lives into prisons of sexual paranoia. Princesses couldn't be alone with any man, including servants, guards, doctors, or even male members of their own families. They had companion ladies specifically assigned to observe every moment of their day and report any interaction that could be interpreted as sexually compromising. They couldn't ride horses because it was believed the movement could break their hymen. They couldn't dance in ways that involved pelvic movements. They couldn't wear tight clothing that might stimulate their bodies. They couldn't sleep alone because it was feared they might masturbate and compromise their purity. English court records document that Anne of Cleves was forced to sleep between two companion ladies throughout her adolescence, and all three women were inspected each morning to ensure no impure activity had occurred during the night. Princesses couldn't read certain books, see certain plays, or hear certain music that might awaken carnal thoughts. They had specific diets designed to suppress sexual desire, mainly dry bread and water, because hot foods like meat and spices were believed to stimulate lust. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was that princesses were constantly reminded that their virginity was more valuable than their lives. They were taught from childhood that losing their virginity before marriage would not only dishonor them, but could cause wars, collapse political alliances, and destroy entire kingdoms. Educational manuals for princesses contained specific stories of royal women who had lost their virginity prematurely and caused national catastrophes. 8- and 9-year-old girls were read these stories as terror warnings about the cosmic consequences of their future sexual failures. Now, if you find this obsession with princesses' virginity as disturbing as it is important for understanding control over female bodies, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more revelations about how historical institutions turned female anatomy into political battlegrounds. The fertility testing horror show. But if the pressure to maintain virginity was devastating, the simultaneous pressure to demonstrate fertility was equally brutal and far more deadly. Because it wasn't enough for a princess to be virgin, she also had to prove she would be capable of producing heirs when the time came, and this demonstration required tests that directly contradicted preserving her virginity. Medieval princesses were subjected to fertility tests that were essentially medical torture disguised as reproductive evaluation. These procedures began when princesses were barely 12 years old and continued until they married or died in the process. Fertility testing included internal examinations to evaluate the size and flexibility of the reproductive canal, administration of herbs that caused artificial menstrual bleeding to test uterine activity, and procedures that stimulated the ovaries to verify they were functioning appropriately. Vatican medical records document that Princess Lucrezia Borgia was subjected to fertility tests so invasive at age 13 that she developed a pelvic infection that nearly killed her. Papal physicians inserted heated metal instruments into her uterus to stimulate reproductive response, and then declared the resulting fevers and hemorrhaging evidence of vigorous fertility. But here comes the contradiction that literally killed princesses. Tests designed to verify fertility frequently compromised their virginity, while methods to preserve virginity frequently damaged their fertility. It was a system designed to fail, regardless of which path the princess took. Medieval doctors had developed instruments specifically to test fertility without compromising virginity, but these instruments were so brutal they caused permanent damage to the reproductive system. Fertility probes were metal rods with expandable ends that were inserted into the uterus to measure reproductive capacity without technically breaking the hymen. Records from the Hospital of Santa Maria in Paris contain graphic descriptions of these procedures that would make a medieval torturer impressed by their cruelty. Princesses were held down while doctors inserted these instruments and then expanded them until the princess screamed in pain, at which point they declared she had demonstrated adequate reproductive sensitivity. Many princesses developed infections, internal scarring, and permanent uterine damage from these fertility tests. Ironically, procedures designed to verify their reproductive capacity frequently left them sterile or with complications that would make future pregnancies dangerous. Princess Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, developed what modern medical records would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder after years of brutal fertility testing. Her supposed madness was actually psychological trauma caused by systematic medical rape during her adolescence. But the physical tests were only part of the terror. Princesses also faced constant psychological pressure to prove they would be successful mothers, even without actual sexual experience. They had to memorize detailed information about pregnancy and childbirth, demonstrate knowledge about infant care, and even practice with dolls that simulated real babies. Princess tutors included motherhood masters who trained them in parenting techniques, but this training included preparation for the possibility that their own children might be taken from them if they failed to meet actual reproductive expectations. Princesses were taught that their only real value would begin after marriage, when they could finally fulfill their divine purpose of producing heirs. But they were also constantly warned that failure in this reproduction would result in divorce, exile, or execution, the deadly marriage trap. Once married, a medieval princess entered what can only be described as the most dangerous phase of her existence. She had to become pregnant within the first year of marriage, carry the pregnancy to term successfully, survive childbirth, and produce a healthy male heir. Failing any of these steps resulted in consequences ranging from divorce to execution. Marriage contracts for princesses explicitly specified the consequences of reproductive failure. Catherine of Aragon had a clause in her marriage contract stating that if she didn't produce a male heir within 3 years, Henry VIII could annul the marriage and demand full dowry repayment to Spain. But the consequences went far beyond legal aspects. Princesses who didn't become pregnant quickly were subjected to medical treatments that were essentially systematic torture disguised as fertility therapy. Fertility treatments included weekly bloodletting to balance reproductive humors, insertion of toxic herbs into the vagina to stimulate the uterus, and administration of potions made from mercury and lead that caused poisoning but were believed to activate the female matrix. Anne Boleyn was subjected to fertility treatments so severe after her first miscarriage that medical records describe internal chemical burns, extreme weight loss, and what was clearly heavy metal poisoning. These treatments, designed to improve her fertility, probably caused the subsequent miscarriages that eventually led to her execution. Pregnant princesses faced their own unique horrors. They were confined to birthing chambers from the 7th month of pregnancy until birth, essentially prisoners in windowless spaces without fresh air or contact with the outside world. During pregnancy, princesses were bled regularly to prevent excess blood that might harm the baby, fed starvation diets to keep the baby appropriately sized, and forced to remain completely motionless to prevent the baby from moving to a dangerous position. Records of Mary Stuart's childbirth document that she was bled every 2 weeks during pregnancy, lost so much weight she couldn't walk unassisted, and was so weak during labor that doctors thought both she and the baby would die. Her prenatal treatment almost guaranteed that childbirth would be a near-death experience, but perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the pressure to produce specifically male heirs. Princesses who gave birth to girls faced not just disappointment, but accusations of reproductive failure that could result in immediate divorce or worse. Medieval doctors had developed elaborate theories about why women produced daughters instead of sons, and all these theories blamed the woman. It was believed that women who weren't hot enough in their matrix produced daughters, that women who thought too much during sex interfered with masculine formation, and that women who didn't pray enough during pregnancy allowed feminine demons to influence the fetus. Catherine of Aragon had 6 documented pregnancies, of which only 1 resulted in a child who lived more than a few months. Each loss was seen as evidence of her failure as a woman, and the psychological pressure of these reproductive failures contributed to her mental and physical health deterioration. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by the brutal reality that a royal woman's value was reduced entirely to her reproductive capacity and sexual purity, definitely subscribe for more revelations about how historical systems turned female bodies into political battlefields. The Medical Execution Protocol. Princesses who repeatedly failed to produce male heirs didn't just face divorce, they faced accusations of witchcraft, poisoning, or demonic pacts. Anne Boleyn was specifically accused of using witchcraft to prevent Henry VIII from having male children with other women, an accusation that contributed directly to her execution. Court records show that many princesses developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, profound depression, and psychosomatic symptoms caused by constant reproductive pressure. They lived in perpetual terror that every menstrual period was evidence of failure, every miscarriage was proof of inadequacy, and every daughter born was a delayed death sentence. But here we arrive at the most devastating reflection of this entire exploration: This system of obsession with female virginity and fertility wasn't really about reproduction or morality. It was about total control over female bodies as tools of political power. Medieval princesses weren't valued as human beings with thoughts, feelings, or desires of their own. They were valued as reproductive objects whose only function was to produce heirs that would consolidate political alliances and secure dynastic successions. The system was specifically designed to be impossible to satisfy. The demand for perfect virginity and proven fertility was a deliberate biological contradiction that guaranteed women would live in constant terror of failing expectations they could never fully meet. This impossibility wasn't a flaw in the system, it was its most important feature. It kept the world's most powerful women in a state of constant vulnerability, ensuring they could never develop real confidence in their position or authority. Historical records show that the few princesses who attempted to resist or modify these expectations were immediately labeled as dangerous rebels and faced severe consequences. The system tolerated no deviation from reproductive demands because its real purpose was control, not reproduction. Societies that most strictly controlled the sexuality and fertility of their noble women also tended to be the most authoritarian in other aspects, suggesting that reproductive control was a fundamental tool of broader social domination. So there you have it. The brutal obsession with virginity and fertility of medieval princesses that trapped them in an impossible biological contradiction that frequently resulted in psychological trauma, physical damage, and premature death. These weren't innocent cultural expectations about female purity. They were deliberate tools of political control that turned the world's most privileged women into victims of a system designed to keep them in perpetual terror about their own worth as human beings. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about traditional roles for women or the simplicity of historical expectations about femininity, remember that those expectations included systems of bodily control that literally killed women for failing to meet biologically contradictory demands. Remember that every reproductive freedom women have today, from control over their own bodies to the right to be valued for something beyond their reproductive capacity, was gained through centuries of struggle against systems that saw women as political objects whose only value was their utility to male interests. And remember that protecting these freedoms requires constant vigilance, because history shows us that societies can backslide toward authoritarian reproductive control with terrifying speed when we don't actively defend women's rights to be valued as complete human beings rather than biological functions. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that modern women can value themselves for their intelligence, achievements, contributions to society, and complete humanity, rather than being reduced to the functionality of their reproductive organs and the integrity of their hymens. Because after diving into this historical nightmare of total reproductive control, I think we can all be deeply grateful to live in an era where a woman's worth isn't determined by humiliating medical tests of her sexual purity and her ability to produce male heirs. And if you made it to the end of this revelation, as devastating as it is necessary about the brutal reality of being a medieval princess, tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. We're moved to know that these truths about historical control of female bodies are reaching people around the world who value as much as we do the importance of protecting female bodily autonomy against systems that seek to reduce women to their reproductive functions.